optimal health, financial freedom, finding your life purpose. It's called The Simple Life. I'm just doing it my way.
Welcome to The Simple Life with Gary Collins, your how-to guide for getting your shit together.
This is life. You gotta work on all these till the day you die. The only thing missing is you getting off your butt and doing it. Hey, Myles, thanks for coming back. It's like we see each other all the time, Myles. You're almost like my long-lost brother.
There you go. Hey, Arizona natives, huh?
I know, right? And with that, it's we hadn't talked that long ago on here. We see each other on Ben Stein and other places. Man, the world has melted down since we talked last. The trucker convoys happened. Now the Ukraine's in a war. We're in, I would consider, a proxy war somewhat. Sliding into the abyss, which I told people, be careful. These guys are idiots. They're going to get us into World War III. It's on tape. That what we had talked about prior is about you're an Australian expat. You've been a U.S. citizen now for what, 30 years?
20.
And you're still in touch. You have family there. And all of a sudden, once this war broke out and the trucker convoy, COVID's gotten quiet. The trucker convoy was part of that, but it was more about freedom. I think Canadians have had enough and they've just had it because Trudeau, what people don't understand, in his family, they're a hardcore communist at their soul. They truly are. And they're corrupt as all get out. His dad was as corrupt as they come. And understanding that and tying that back into Australia, you had brought up, because I didn't know this, that Australia's been in bed with China for a long time now. Yep. And that's why we're seeing this radicalization and kind of strange Australia that we didn't even see coming. And we just saw it in Canada as well. Could you kind of briefly jump back into that and talk about how China became so influential on Australia and what's going on right now? Because it got quiet.
Well, I left Australia as a resident 1999. And right about that time, I guess the World Trade Organization had invited China back in, and China became kind of an active member of the world economy. And I didn't see anything going on about me when I was living in Australia. We were coming out of a kind of a recession. We didn't really see the fruits of things like the dot-com boom, which were happening over here. Which is really one of the reasons why I returned. I came back to the States was because of that. So when I came back here, I just was 100% embedded in the US, and I never really worried too much about what was going on back in Australia. I'd go back every year or so to see family. And I remember, I think sometime around about 2001, my wife and I went back and realized that there was this big kind of real estate property boom going on. And because we were still citizens, we could get mortgages in Australia. So we bought some property back then because we could buy it cheap. We saw that there was this upswing happening and we had access to credit. So we did. But other than that, my relationship with Australia became kind of arm's length. I really rarely ever went back. And as years progressed, I got to around about 2008. And at that point, I didn't go back until about 2016. My wife's parents, who were really the only thing holding us back, they were mobile, so they could come over here. And so they'd come over for 3 months of the year and live with us. And so we had no reason to go back. Well, what happened was when you leave a country for that period of time, you get this weird A-B experience when you go back. You get to see the place that you thought it was, the place that you remembered it was, to the place it became. And we would go, my wife's father died, and then her mother was unable to travel as much. So now the ball was back on our court to go back. So since around about 2016, 2017, we'd go back on a regular basis. Every time we'd go back, we'd stay for at least a couple of months. And I remember little instances of these things. You'd see in the news that since sometime around about 2003, they started to do business with China. It began with China buying a lot of Australian exports. Australia is an exporting country. It always has been. It's got an enormous amount of land, enormous amount of agriculture, and very few people. So it's great at mining stuff. It's great at growing stuff. It's great at fishing and agriculture, and it ships all that stuff straight out to the rest of the world. China was buying up more and more of Australia, and the biggest thing was iron ore. They were using it for steel production in China, which was building their cities there, and that was being fueled by the American demand for cheap globalized product from China. You know, the typical, you go into Walmart and everything's made in China was, you know, going crazy in the early 2000s and then 2010s, right? So that was kind of the pull of demand, which meant they needed raw material to supply and they needed to build infrastructure to do it. So they'd go to countries like Australia, but not just Australia, they'd go to Africa, Sri Lanka, South America, everywhere they could get what they needed to build their cities, to build their products, to build the things we, the United States, were demanding from them, and Europe as well, of course. But with all of this said, Australia dodged the bullet when it came to 2008. When we had the global financial crisis, they had absolutely no impact from that. Their real estate didn't change at all. Their employment rates didn't change at all. They were just living on the wealth that was Chinese demand for raw material. So after about 2011 or so, the demand had gotten to such a level, and by then the Australian farmers, the Australian producers and the exporters had become so addicted to China, they became tethered. And then China started this process of embedding themselves within the society of Australia. They did it initially with foreign exchange students. They would basically take over the universities because they were funding it all. So they would go and send in their foreign exchange students. They did deals with the Australian government, which we could probably argue whether the word corrupt is appropriate. I think it is. They made a deal where for $25,000, a student could be a foreign exchange student in Australia, and after 2 years, that was enough for them to be able to petition for residency.
Wow.
With that residency, they could bring family members over. So it was kind of like what we would call anchor babies. These was like anchor students that China would put in. Yeah.
Well, and that's a lot of money. I mean, 25 grand a student, you can run in a small economy. You get enough students in off just that.
Absolutely. And what was even worse was the fact that this was being abused and there were no limits on the quantity. Now you've got 1.5 billion people in China and you had 23 million at the time in Australia. So massive difference in population and very similar size land mass. So all of a sudden you've got this population that wants to seed themselves into Australia en masse. It got to the point where 1 in 5 Australians were of Asian descent. And I say that in the most diplomatic way. They were Chinese.
So 20% of your population was Chinese.
Correct.
And your government didn't see any problem with this whatsoever.
No, they in fact justified it. I remember there were so many debates going on there that were what they called the pro-growth agenda. And the idea was the more population that we had, the more taxpayers and the more wealth the country will have. And look, all these Chinese are coming in with suitcases of cash and we're not going to say no to them. I mean, look what they're doing to our economy. Well, yeah, there was that. It was out of hand. And then what happened was around about 2017, it started unraveling. So what we began seeing in Australia were that operatives of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, were doing things like trying to be elected in local council political positions. And then that grew into state, senators and representatives and so on, and eventually all the way up into federal, because there was nothing in the Australian law that said you had to be a naturally born Australian citizen to run in any political capacity. I mean, and there were premiers of states that were American or Asian or Canadian or whatever who were there because they could. The law allowed them to do that. And China inserted operatives who became known to be direct CCP representatives, or let's call it spies, right?
Call it what it is.
right, into political positions, and they started changing the way that states would do rules. Like China had this thing going on at the time called the Silk Road Initiative, and the idea was that no, I'm sorry, I'm calling it wrong. It was Belt and Road Initiative. I'm sorry. The Belt and Road Initiative was this attempt of China to build trade routes using other countries, kind of like depots for ships that could then move to another region and onward. They were doing things like in Sri Lanka. They had gone into Sri Lanka with a lot of money, and they got them very addicted to Chinese money. And they said to the government there, okay, well, we want to build a port for our Chinese ships to be able to dock at on their way to the Persian Gulf because they need to refuel and whatever. And Sri Lanka, you should build us a port and we'll pay you, money for all these ships. And Sri Lanka's like, that's really good, but we haven't got any money. Oh, we'll loan it to you. Okay. So we'll give you all this money, build the port, and then you pay it back, right? Yeah, well, Sri Lanka goes, yeah, we haven't got any money. Well, we'll own you then. We'll own the port and we'll control the entire route of trade through this port that we now own, and we have a sovereign lease on that you can't refute. Well, that started happening in Australia. The city of Darwin in the north of Australia, they took their seaport and they leased it to a Chinese company that was directly a proxy of the CCP for a 99-year lease for like, I don't know, $50 million or $100 million or something like that. And the premier, which is like the governor effectively of the state, mysteriously resigned shortly after that and retired somewhere in the Bahamas.
Oh, interesting. Interesting how that works. Yeah.
So this continued. And what happened now is the Australian media started to shine a light on it, and they started to see all of this corruption that was the Chinese playbook going on in a country which in the past has been traditionally a very trusting government, not really a great deal of corruption, a lot of incompetence, but, everyone laughed at that. But there was never anything corrupt per se. But all of a sudden it started to come out. And then we started to see spies who turned on the CCP and started to, give out all the secrets to the Australians, and the Australian equivalent of the FBI or the CIA, I guess it's called ASIO, started to bring these guys in and brain dump them and find out what was going on. At that point, it was like, oh, okay, hang on. We've been duped here.